Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and today I'm going crazy, totally crazy, making a crazy quilt. I used the scraps from my Eclipse quilt to create this totally crazy infinity scarf. So I want to teach you how to piece a crazy quilt. And piecing this is really fun, totally freeform, but it can incorporate Y seams, which a lot of people think are kind of tricky. So let's learn how to piece a totally crazy quilt together. So the first step is to grab some scraps, and I generally tried to grab pieces that were about the same length or, had a size or side of the scrap that more or less fit together, and just stitch them together. And these edges are not straight, I should add. I mean, these have not been trimmed up, they've not been squared. I'm going at this, with the idea that it's meant to be crazy, it's meant to be irregular, and as we piece the pieces together, we're going to make them make more sense. So I'm just going to piece a whole mess of stuff, and it doesn't have to be accurate. This is one situation where you can get away with whatever seam allowance you want to stitch. If you want to stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, go on ahead and do it. No one's going to yell at you for it because this is a crazy quilt, and it is a total crazy. I didn't realize it when I first got started quilting that there is actually a difference between a crazy quilt and a contained crazy. A contained crazy is when you make basically kind of a block, basically a crazy quilt block, and then you square it up to, let's say 12 inches. If I pieced and then squared it up at the end to create a block and then put those blocks together, then that's a contained crazy because, you kind of contained the crazy into a square. I like that name. Something about that just really makes me laugh. But this, I'm trying to go full on crazy, like 100%. So no squaring. We're not going to turn these into dedicated shapes. We're not going to make things make sense in a traditional way. Now I've got some bigger pieces here. I'm just going to hack at it. Again, not going to apply by any direct rules. Now this piece has already been stitched, but I need to press that. So over here, you can see I've got my pressing board set up and my cutting mat. So right next to the machine, I've got the ability to press and cut here real close by. So now I'm going to layer this on. As you can see, that piece is kind of off and slightly curved, and I'm just going to back that up a bit and slide it underneath the foot and keep on stitching. Now when I end up with a big seam allowance, sometimes I'll go in and trim it up, and sometimes I don't bother. You really have to go at this, whatever you're feeling. However it feels best to you to stitch it. I do always like to start and end with a scrap charger. This is just a folded over scrap, and it just keeps my thread tails organized and stops the thread from getting sucked down into the inside of the machine. It also wastes less bobbin thread to use that. So I'm just going to trim this up a bit. Once I piece through a chain of several pieces, I'll take them and open up the seam allowances and check out how things are looking. And all I'm doing here is just running my fingernail right along that seam to open it up nicely. So that's the last one of that set. Everything's all nicely pressed open. I think I'm going to take all of this over to the pressing board and give it a good press next. So here I'm just laying things out, giving it a quick press. And these are some of the pieces that I've already created. And you can see just how totally random everything is. Now the one thing that bothers me about this piece is this feels too long, and I feel like I want to cut that up a bit. When I had pieces, the scraps that I had, some of them were still in really long shapes like this. So the solution to that is just to start breaking it up. So here's some of the other pieces. And these are all going to get connected together somehow. I might stick that to that somehow. I don't know. It's just going to be, I'm just creating these random shapes and allowing those to flow. And then I'm going to start cutting things up and putting them together as I go. So let's see here. I think we need to break up this a good bit. And you can see my ruler doesn't even properly fit on this piece. That's no big deal. When I first started these, I wasn't even using my rotary cutter. I was using scissors to cut everything, and that was also kind of nice because that was, you know, kind of a reminder of, you know, my grandmother didn't have a rotary cutter. She made lots and lots of quilts. My great-grandmothers made lots and lots of quilts. They didn't have rotary cutters. And sometimes when we only use rotary cutters and we only have straight lines and sharp angles, you know, you can start getting really dependent upon that. And sometimes it's really nice just to change it up completely. So there we go. I broke up that really long straight piece, and now I can just take this and rotate it around. And let's see here, which way do I like it better? I could put it there. That would be connecting those pieces back again. I could also put it here. That would kind of create a big blob of that stuff. I'm always looking at, okay, how do I minimize a big blob of the same thing? You know, and then I'm also I don't want to break down my pieces so much that I get really tiny slivers. This actually looks pretty good. Kind of like that. So I'm just going to lay that over that. I'll take that to the machine and stitch it. So some of this is just kind of planning and creating stacks and a plan of what I'm going to stitch the next time I go to the machine. So let's plan another one. Let's see here. I kind of like that with that. That looks good. And, you know, if you are looking at that going, I don't even know how to stitch that, or, you know, you couldn't stitch it straight, you can always set your ruler on it and trim it up nice and straight. That's always allowed. You know, it's just sometimes nice to play around with it. And even if you do end up with a curve, figure out how you're going to work with that. You know, if you are allowing curves into your design, that can be a cool design element too. Here we go. I think, yeah, that roughly fits. Something like that. That's kind of cool. All right, I got 3 more stacks I'll take to the machine and stitch these next. So I stitched to 1 stitch off that scrap charger, then lift my foot. I'm using a knee lifter here to lift that slightly, and I can slide the pieces right underneath. And as I know, you know, I'm stitching a straight line, but I know these fabrics kind of wing out. I just try and maintain a nice straight line if I can. It does make it a little easier if things have been trimmed up, like this one I trimmed up real nice and neat. But it's not required. That's the thing I want to emphasize here, is you can do this however you want. And it's really fun to allow things to flow and bend and be weird and wonky. You know, like this, I'm letting and leaving all of this fabric extending, and I'm just using this straight line here that I created when I cut that piece. That's going to be my guide. And I will trim up all of this excess after I stitch the seam. Now the really cool thing that I started experimenting with was Y seams. And I have been quilting for a long time, since 2005. And I have managed to avoid Y seams almost completely. Just by sheer dint of refusing to stitch them. Like, I'm just not going to bother with that. So creating this, I knew I would have to play around with them because Y seams are sometimes required. You know, when you piece something and you want it to look totally crazy and not like it was connected together with individual blocks that were all trimmed up just exactly perfect, then you'll have a situation where you might find a Y seam coming in. And it's a really useful skill to be able to know how to piece that. And it's really, honestly, not that hard and not that scary. So let's create something and make a Y seam next. So the first thing I've done to create a Y seam is to create the situation of a Y seam. So I had this piece and I basically just stitched it onto this edge, and I stopped 1/4 inch from the edge of this piece. And that's important because we're going to need seam allowance both on this side and on this side to connect the piece that'll go right here. So step 1, flip this over and finger press the seam open. Now I should add, this is the technique that I'm using for crazy quilts. I will probably use a totally different technique if I was actually cutting out the pieces real exactly and making something specifically like, let's say, diamonds that were properly cut and meant to be pieced with Y seams. So this is only the technique that I'm using for this particular type of quilt. Okay, so that looks good. So now I'm going to find a piece, a shape that's going to fit in here. And I've got several fabrics that I can choose from. And it's really just a matter of kind of playing around and figuring out what look you like. So we could go there. We could go with that, or I've got that piece, and it looks like that's actually the scrap that's closest in size, but I've got a lot of it all around. So sometimes I'll make a decision based on, you know, what fabrics are close by, and sometimes I'll make a decision just on the shape of the scrap, and it doesn't really matter either way. Now, the most important thing that I found playing around with this is that the scrap is bigger than the space that you need. So I'm not going to try and cut this exact shape. I found that that often ended up not working out all that well. Instead, I'm going to make sure that this is bigger than I need. And I'm just going to rough cut this down here on the end, making sure that I have more than enough. Now I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to flip this over. Okay, so I know that this piece is going to be inserted. It's going to end up looking something like that, kind of coming in here with this Y seam placement. So I know that I need to stitch this piece to this side. So I'm going to flip it over just like that, and I'm going to pull it down so that way I'm starting out right here where those two pieces come together. So let's take this to the machine. I'm going to start stitching up here, stitch all the way down to where this Y seam will begin. I'm going to stop right here and backstitch. That's the plan. I'm just lining this up generally, lift the foot, slide the pieces under. And the thing about Y seams is, you know, you can't really lose focus of what you're doing. You got to remember that you're stitching something kind of weird. And this is going to be one of those situations that I actually backstitch in piecing, which is something I very, very rarely do. Most of the time, I depend upon, you know, just the strength of the fabric and the thread holding things together. Well, in this situation, I am going to really put some stress and strain on this end point, and because of that, I'm going to backstitch. So here is where my stitching came up to on this side, and I backstitched right here. This is the little extra flap of seam allowance. I'm going to pull this down so it's out of my way. Basically, I'm going to pull kind of this whole shape down out of my way, and whoop, got kind of caught up there. Now I'm going to slide this piece down, and I'm going to stitch right up to where those two fabrics are joined together, and that's where I'm going to stop, backstitch, and take the piece off the machine. So right there. Now I think I took one stitch too many. That's okay, we can recover. There we go, that looks good. As you can see, Y seams are a bit messy and they're a bit complicated, but I'm having a really good time. The wonderful thing about it, learning this while I'm working on a crazy quilt, is that even if it comes out bad, all I have to do is slice it up and try again. And that's great. It feels really forgiving to be working on this way and trying it out. So, okay, the next step is to press the seam open so that way we have the whole thing flat. Having it flat is really important at this point because, you know, if you piece this weird, you can end up with something that looks like, well, it just looks like some kind of crazy fabric folding monstrosity. You know, you want it to be flat if it's a quilt, if you're wanting it to be something that's going to finish up and rest flat on a bed. And I'm just taking a look here, making sure, you know, I don't think I stitched too far. That's actually looking okay. I'm going to give this a quick press. Make sure it's nice and flat. There we go. And just basically kind of just focus on the seam that you've stitched and don't really worry about these fabrics that are kind of doing their own wild dance here. That's what we're going to sort out next. And this is the part that's a little bit tricky and it's a little bit fiddly. So this is the piece that was already there, that was already established, and I already decided that it was going to fold over kind of like that. So I'm going to go on ahead and finger crease that in that shape and press it so it's nice and flat. Now I'm going to take the shape that I just stitched on and I'm going to tuck it underneath. So again, getting it nice and flat, making sure that everything is smooth and even. Again, press it. Just like that. So what I've done here is I've created a really nice crease on that fabric. I've overlapped it so I know I have more than enough fabric here that will provide seam allowance. And now I just need to make sure that these two fabrics hold together securely so they're not going to slip as I stitch them. So what do I do when I don't want something to slip? I glue it down. And this is a total cheat. You know, it's one of those things that I like to do. You don't have to, of course. But I really think that glue makes everything with piecing and applique much, much easier. So I'm just running a very thin line of Elmer's glue. That's what this is. It's just Elmer's glue in one of our micro tip glue bottles. You can find these at leahday.com. So I just applied that thin layer of glue right inside that fold. Now I smooth it down and hit it with my dry iron. Now what that's going to do is it's going to dry that Elmer's glue really nice and fast. Now we can take this to the machine and stitch the seam. So what I'm going to do, open this up. You can see the seam. It's a crease line now that you can see really easily. And I'm just going to stitch right along that fold. So you may be able to see that crease line just a little bit better from this angle. You can see how I folded it over. This is all extra fabric from that scrap. That's just fine. I'm just going to slip these pieces under the machine. And I'm going to actually pull up my bobbin thread this time. I don't want that thread tail to get sucked into the machine and create a mess on the back of the quilt. I want to make sure I'm starting exactly where I want to start and it's nice and clean and neat. So take 3 stitches forward, 3 stitches back. And what that does, the reason why I'm back stitching there is it just provides more stability. There's just a little bit more strain on that Y seam than there is on a regular seam, and I think that's important. So now I can stitch right back onto my scrap charger, and we can take a look at that seam and how it came out. So let's check it out and see how it went. Now you're going to have extra fabric and some bulk and stuff, but you can generally smooth everything out and just eyeball it and see if things have worked out well. And this has worked out really, really well. So now let's clean it up. We have some thread tails we need to clip. Take care of those. I can open that back out and I've got all this extra scrap fabric here that can be clipped away. So let's carefully cut that away. And then I like to press my seam allowances open, but this seam was glued. Well, I probably should have pulled this apart before I cut the seam allowance and trimmed it down, but I can still get my fingers in there and basically just break open that glue. I'm just opening that seam allowance back up again. The glue is really nice. It holds in place firmly. It's better, much, much better than pinning. However, the great thing about Elmer's glue is always a light bond. So it's not like you're cementing it together permanently. You can always pick it back out. Now you're going to have some weirdness with your seam allowance. I don't think it really matters how everything goes. Here I'm kind of fanning one seam in one direction and one seam in the other direction. And the key though is just press it nice and flat. Use that iron, use that heat, put it to good use. And you can see just how pretty that is. Now, you might be wondering, why bother? You know, this actually turned into a really long seam, so this could have been pieced, like this piece could have been pieced here and then put together, and that certainly is open to you. There are other situations where you can only create that effect with a Y seam. Let's see here, I'm going to kind of look through these and show you a situation where a Y seam was necessary to create that effect. So here was a situation where I almost kind of bent that shape around that angle, and that was created with a Y seam. Here's another space that was created with a Y seam, and that angle there could not have been created any other way. The Y seam was required for that. And I think that's pretty, well, no, here's another one. So this angle's coming in here, this angle's coming in here, and that angle's coming down. So I think it just adds more drama, more interest to the blocks. You know, now I can even put these together, and maybe I'll use some Y seams as I put these together. So I just wanted you to know how to make a totally crazy block, how to put that together, and then also how to use those Y seams to open up even more possibilities for your piecing. So that's how you create a totally crazy quilt. Now, a little bit of an easier process would be contained crazy, and that is where you piece blocks, then trim those blocks up to a set shape. So let's say 10.5-inch squares, then you piece those squares together. That's a little bit easier, and you can end up avoiding those Y seams completely if you do it that way. It's the way I've done a lot of crazy quilts over the years. But you know, something that's totally crazy like this, it really has that really unique crazy quilt effect. And I think it was worth it to try it out with this project. I took my little crazy quilt, I kind of pieced it into a long rectangle. I took that and I layered it with some flannel and then minky. I took that, sewed the edges, turned it inside out. That created my scarf. I did a little bit of quilting just to stabilize the layers. And then I took the ends and sewed them together, and that's how I created the infinity knot scarf. It wasn't the easiest part of the process, and I did have to do a little bit of hand stitching on the minky in order to completely close it, but I love this project. I love the finished effect, and I cannot wait to wear this winter. It's very warm, and the minky is super soft, so I'm loving that part of it. So I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and learned a lot. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it with your friends. I really want to help more people learn how to make beautiful quilts. So you sharing it definitely helps me out a lot. You can subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss our future videos and tutorials. We have new videos coming out every single week. Now, if you were interested in any of the supplies that you saw in the video, like the micro tip glue bottle, we actually sell that. So come and check out our quilt shop at leahday.com, and that helps support our business and helps me continue to make new video tutorials. So come and check it out and enjoy watching and learning more about quilting. Until next time, let's go quilt.